They sold her like a piece of land, quietly, coldly, and without once looking her in the eye. The people she called family, the people she trusted with her whole life. They sat around a table, signed a piece of paper, and traded her future for a stack of cash. Lena Mercer didn't know it until it was too late. Until someone came knocking on her door and told her she was no longer her own boss. But they miscalculated one thing: Lena wasn't the type to be sold. This is the story of a woman fleeing betrayal, a cold-blooded man who, for the first time in his life, chooses to stand on the right side, and a wild land that shows no mercy to the weak. If you're watching this video, hit like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has come. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Lena Mercer's mother had died 11 years ago. She didn't think much of that coincidence at the time. She was too busy trying to read the words without her hands shaking. It was not a long letter. It didn't need to be. 3 short paragraphs from a man named Doyle Ashford, written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd had a formal education and wanted you to know it. The first paragraph introduced himself as a land broker operating out of Caldwell Crossing. The second explained that he had recently acquired certain contractual interests pertaining to the parcel of property registered under her name, 240 acres of hardscrabble grass and creek-cut land about 12 miles northeast of Ridgeback. The third paragraph, the one that made her stomach go cold, informed her that she would be expected to present herself at the Caldwell Crossing Courthouse on the 14th of the month to finalize the terms of what he called a marital conveyance agreement. She read that phrase 3 times. Marital conveyance agreement. She set the letter down on the kitchen table. Outside, a pair of crows were fighting over something in the yard. One of them kept screaming, short, sharp bursts that cut through the morning quiet like a blade. Lena was 26 years old. She had never been married. She had never agreed to anything with a man named Doyle Ashford. And as far as she knew, no one had the legal standing to promise her to anyone because she was not property, and the land was hers, inherited straight from her father's estate and recorded clearly in the county ledger. But the letter had a signature, and beneath that signature were 2 witnesses. The first name she didn't recognize. The second name was her uncle's. Harlan Mercer lived about 4 miles east, on a smaller spread that had belonged to Lena's grandfather before the old man split the land between his 2 sons. Lena's father, James, had been the harder worker and had ended up with the larger portion. Harlan had always resented that, in the quiet way that certain men resent things. Not loudly, not directly, but in the way they talked about fairness and what they deserved, and how life hadn't been square with them. Lena had grown up listening to it. She thought it was just talk. She rode the 4 miles in under an hour. She didn't knock when she got there. Harlan was at the breakfast table with his wife, Dessa, and their youngest son, Boyd, who was 18 and had their father's eyes and nobody's conscience. They all looked up when she came through the door. Nobody looked surprised. That alone told her most of what she needed to know. "Sit down, Lena," Harlan said. "No." She put the letter on the table in front of him. "Tell me what this is." He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, the way a man looks at something he's already decided to stand behind. Then he sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "It's a business arrangement," he said. "A sensible one." "Whose business?" "Ours. The family's." He said family like it still meant something. "You're out there on 240 acres by yourself, Lena. You can't work that land properly. You can't hold it. And you're not getting younger. I'm 26. And there's men out here who'd make good use of that land and provide you a stable." "Who is Doyle Ashford?" The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Boyd shifted in his seat. Dessa set her coffee cup down very carefully. Harlan's jaw tightened. "He's a reputable businessman. He brokers land deals across the whole of this territory." "He is a buyer," Lena said. "You sold him something that wasn't yours to sell. You put your name on a contract that signed me over to some arrangement I never agreed to, and then you listed yourself as a witness, which means you know exactly what you did. The land's not worth anything if nobody works it. The land is mine." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "My father left it to me. It's in the county ledger under my name. You have no legal authority to broker it, assign it, or sign any contract concerning it." Harlan finally looked at her directly. And that was when she understood fully and completely what kind of thing this was. Because there was no guilt in his eyes. There was a calculation, a tired, settled calculation, like a man who has already thought through every argument and decided he can outlast them all. "Lena," he said, "the arrangement is already done. Ashford paid, the money is spent. You showing up here angry doesn't unspend it." For a moment she just stood there. The crows were probably still fighting somewhere out in the world. Dessa hadn't moved. Boyd was watching her with the specific curiosity of someone who wanted to see how she'd break. She picked the letter up off the table, folded it twice, and put it back in her coat pocket. "I'll see you in court," she said. "Lena." She was already walking out the door. She didn't go home. She knew better than that. If Ashford had already been paid and the arrangement was, in his mind, in her uncle's mind, finalized, then the 14th was 12 days away, and 12 days was not a lot of time to undo whatever legal machinery had already been set in motion. She needed to talk to someone who understood how these contracts worked. She needed a lawyer, or at least someone who knew where the county records were kept. The nearest town with a working courthouse was Ridgeback, about 7 miles south. Lena had been there maybe a dozen times in the past 2 years. For supplies, for the occasional social occasion she couldn't avoid, once to pay her property tax. She knew most of the faces there, though not deeply. She knew the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Cord Braddock, who had the reputation of being fair when fairness was convenient and flexible when it wasn't. She knew Garrett Crow by reputation only. Everyone in a 50-mile radius knew Garrett Crow by reputation, though the reputation varied depending on who was telling it. Some people said he was the wealthiest private rancher in the whole territory, with land that stretched so far you could ride from sunup to midday and still be on his property. Some people said he was cold, not mean, exactly, but the kind of cold that came from having been in enough bad situations that sentiment had been burned out of him like moisture from dried beef. Some people said he'd killed 3 men in his life, though none of those killings had ever resulted in charges because by all accounts the men had needed killing. What everyone agreed on was that Garrett Crow kept to himself, didn't involve himself in other people's business, and had not, in living memory, done a single thing out of charity or sentiment. Lena had no particular intention of crossing paths with him. She rode into Ridgeback with the letter in her pocket, and her jaw set, and went straight to the county clerk's office, which was a narrow room attached to the side of the courthouse that smelled like old paper and lamp oil. The clerk was a thin, nervous man named Pettigrew, who wore his spectacles on the end of his nose and moved like he was always worried about being overheard. "I need to look at my property records," Lena said. "Mercer Homestead, northeast parcel, 240 acres. Pettigrew found the ledger, laid it open, ran his finger down the page. He stopped. His finger hovered. "Miss Mercer," he said very carefully. "What?" "There's a notation here." He cleared his throat. "A notation from 9 days ago, indicating that a lien has been registered against this property pending resolution of a contract dispute filed by one D. Ashford of Caldwell Crossing." She looked at the ledger. There it was, in fresh ink that was still slightly darker than the surrounding text. A lien, which meant she couldn't sell the land, couldn't transfer it, couldn't do much of anything with it while the lien was active. How long does a lien like this last? In standard practice, pending resolution, it would remain active until either the court rules in the plaintiff's favor or the defendant provides proof of contractual invalidity. He paused. "Have you seen the contract itself, Miss Mercer? Not just correspondence, but the actual filed document?" "No. The filed contract would be in the Caldwell Crossing courthouse, not here. It would be the original document, with signatures." "Is my signature on it?" He hesitated again. "I cannot speak to what's in Caldwell Crossing's records. I only have what's been forwarded here." She thanked him and left. Out on the street, she stood for a moment in the early afternoon light and tried to think clearly. The situation as she understood it, her uncle had signed something. Doyle Ashford had filed it and registered a lien against her land. The full contract was in Caldwell Crossing. She had 12 days before whatever they were calling a marital conveyance hearing was scheduled. She needed to get to Caldwell Crossing. She needed to see that contract. And she probably needed a lawyer who wasn't already in someone's pocket, which in this particular territory was going to be difficult because the men with the money tended to have long memories about who had represented which side of which dispute. She was mentally calculating the ride time to Caldwell Crossing when someone walked into her from the side. Not hard. It was more that she'd stopped in the middle of the boardwalk and someone had come around the corner of the hardware store without looking. She stumbled back a step. The man caught her elbow before she went off the edge of the boardwalk into the mud. When she got her footing and looked up, the first thing she noticed was that he was tall. The second thing she noticed was the way people on the street were watching. Not at the near collision, but at him specifically, the way people watch something they are both impressed by and slightly wary of. "Watch yourself," he said, and let go of her arm. He wasn't what she'd expected from the reputation. She'd built a picture in her head over the years of a man who looked the part of someone feared, hard-edged, perhaps, or ostentatiously armed. Garrett Crow was neither of those things exactly. He was maybe mid-30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by time and outdoors, into something that wasn't handsome or ugly, but was very much present. Steady gray eyes, a coat that had been good quality once and was still functional. He looked like a man who had stopped caring whether he impressed anyone a long time ago and found the freedom of it useful. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't paying attention." "Neither was I." He glanced down at the letter she'd half pulled from her pocket when she caught her balance. His eyes moved to it once and then away, the way a careful man's eyes moved. "You all right?" "Fine." She tucked the letter back into her coat. He nodded once and moved past her. She watched him go. Not because there was anything romantic about it, but because something about his manner caught at her in a way she couldn't immediately name. He moved like someone who didn't expect the world to accommodate him, which was different from arrogance in a specific and interesting way. She filed the observation away and went to find a place to stay the night. She'd make for Caldwell Crossing in the morning. The problem with Caldwell Crossing was that it was 60 miles east, across terrain that wasn't particularly kind to solo riders in late autumn. The passes were fine in the lower elevations, but the middle section cut through a stretch of open country that had no real settlements and carried a reputation for attracting the type of person who saw a lone rider as an opportunity. She knew this. She went anyway. She made it about 23 miles before the trouble found her. It started as a sound, hoofbeats behind her on the trail, too steady and too fast to be casual. She'd been riding through a cut between two rises, and the echo made it hard to count numbers. She didn't look back. Looking back invited a certain kind of conversation she wasn't ready to have. But they weren't looking for conversation. The first shot cracked past her horse's ears from somewhere to her left, and the animal went sideways and nearly threw her. She got control, got low, and pushed the horse forward, but the terrain ahead was tightening into a narrow slot between rock faces that she couldn't clear without coming to almost a full stop. She came around the bend and pulled up hard. 3 men, blocking the trail ahead. 1 on foot, 2 mounted. The one on foot had his rifle already up and pointed at her chest. All of them were wearing the kind of expression that said this wasn't their first time doing something like this. "Step down," the standing one said. He had a flat, bored voice that was somehow worse than angry would have been. "You're the Mercer woman. We've got a job to bring you back to your family." "My family," she said, "sent you." "Your uncle did," which amounts to the same thing. She held still on the horse, thinking. The rifle was close enough that she couldn't ride for it and expect to come out the other side. The 2 mounted men were behind. She'd counted the hoofbeats, 3 in front, 2 behind, and her own horse was already spooked and breathing hard. She was still calculating when the situation changed. There was a single shot from somewhere above and behind the 3 men, close enough to kick up dirt between the feet of the standing rifleman and the rock face to his right. The man jumped back half a step. The 2 mounted men's horses both shied. "I wouldn't point that at her." The voice came from the rise to the right. Lena turned her head and saw Garrett Crow sitting on a gray horse about 60 feet up the slope, partially behind an outcropping of rock. He had a rifle resting across his saddle with no particular drama, the kind of ease that came from having done this often enough that it was boring. "This isn't your business, Crow," the standing man said. He hadn't lowered the rifle. "I've noticed that," Garrett said. "I'm making it mine anyway. Set the gun down. All 3 of you." There was a pause, the kind of pause where men who think they might win try to calculate whether they actually do. Lena watched the rifleman's face and saw the moment the calculation didn't come out in his favor. He set the gun down in the dirt. The 2 mounted men followed. The 2 behind her, she heard, did something that sounded like retreat. Hoofbeats moving away, picking up speed. Garrick rode down the slope at an angle, keeping the rifle easy in his hands until he was close enough to the three men that the distance was no longer the question. He looked at them without particular hostility, the way a man looks at a problem he's encountered before and knows how to handle. "Take your horses and go," he said. "Leave the guns." "You can't take our guns." "I can leave them in the dirt here for you to pick up after I'm over the next rise. Either way, you're not carrying them out of this canyon today." Another pause. The rifleman picked up his gun from where he'd set it, looked at it for a moment, then set it on a rock. The others followed. Then they rode. Garrick watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he looked at Lena. "You're riding to Caldwell Crossing," he said. It was not a question. "That's not your business either." "No?" He tilted his head slightly. "I was behind you on the trail when they started. I know where the trail goes from here, and Caldwell Crossing is the only thing 60 miles east that's worth riding to alone." He paused. "You're Lena Mercer. I recognized the letter in your hand this morning." She looked at him directly. "You know what the letter was?" "I know what letters from Doyle Ashford look like." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but enough. "He sent one to my ranch 4 months ago. Different situation. Same signature." That surprised her. She didn't try to hide it. "He came after your land?" "He came after a parcel I'd sold to a homesteading family 6 years back. Tried to claim the sale was fraudulent. It wasn't." Garrick looked toward the mouth of the canyon, where the dust from the retreating riders was still visible. "He lost that one. But he's still operating in this territory, which means he hasn't run out of victims yet." Lena processed this. Then she said, "Why did you step in just now?" He was quiet for a moment. Not awkward quiet, considering quiet, which was different. "I don't know exactly," he said, which she hadn't expected. "I saw the letter this morning and I thought about it more than I should have. Then I saw you ride out of town and I thought about it some more." He shook his head slightly, like the whole thing puzzled him. "I'm heading east anyway. I'll ride with you to Caldwell Crossing if you're willing." She studied him for a long few seconds. She had no particular reason to trust him. She had no particular reason to distrust him either, which was better than she could say for most of the people in her life at the moment. "All right," she said. They rode. They made camp that first night at a dry streambed that offered some shelter from the wind without being so enclosed that they couldn't see approach from multiple directions. Garrick built the fire small and set it back into a nook in the rocks so the light wouldn't carry. Lena noticed that without mentioning it, it was the kind of precaution a person took without thinking when they'd spent enough time in situations where being found was the danger. She told him the outline of what had happened while she fed sticks to the fire. She wasn't generous with detail. She gave him the facts and left the feeling out of it, the way she'd trained herself to do with anything that hurt badly enough to embarrass her. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. "Your uncle signed as a witness," he said when she was done. "His name is on the letter, yes. Whether his name is on the original contract, I don't know yet." A witness signature on that kind of document would suggest he had active knowledge. Garrick turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a plain metal cup, dented from travel. "In Caldwell Crossing, the contract will be filed under Ashford's business name. He registers them as property transactions, not personal agreements, keeps them out of the family court records, which makes them harder to challenge. You know this specifically. I hired a man to look into him after the incident with my homesteaders. I know more about how Doyle Ashford operates than he'd like me to." He looked at the fire. "He targets isolated landowners, women alone, or older settlers without family connections. He uses family members when he can, people close to the target who can be pressured or paid into providing signatures. Then he wraps the whole thing in contract language that sounds legitimate until you pull it apart. Is it legitimate? Legally?" Garrick considered. "Parts of it. He's careful. He leaves himself exit routes in case someone pushes back hard enough. But the core of what he does, using coerced family signatures to bind a property owner to a transaction they never agreed to. That's fraud. It's just fraud buried deep enough that most of his targets don't have the resources to dig it out in time." Lena looked at the fire for a moment. She was tired, not just from the day's riding, but from the kind of tired that comes from betrayal, the kind that sits behind your eyes and makes everything feel like it's slightly further away than it should be. "My uncle took money," she said. "That's the part I keep catching on. He didn't do it out of spite. He didn't hate me. He just weighed what I was worth, and decided the number was acceptable. Garrick was quiet. That's a specific kind of ugly, she said. Worse than hate, in some ways. Hate at least notices you. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted in a way she didn't have a name for. Not pity. She would have closed down completely at pity. Something more like recognition, the way a person looks when they've been in the same country, even if not the same town. Yeah, he said. That's about right. They didn't talk much after that. She slept on her side with her back to the rock and her coat pulled over her shoulders. The fire burned low and steady. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved in the brush. An animal, probably. And she heard Garrick shift on the other side of the fire, checking, then settling back. She lay awake longer than she wanted to, staring at the rock face above her. The stars were visible at the top edge of the canyon cut, cold and clear and enormous. She thought about her father, who had loved this land with a straightforward and uncomplicated love that she'd inherited along with the land itself. She thought about what it meant to have a home, not just property, but a place you'd stayed long enough to know where the water ran low in summer and which fence post needed replacing every third year and which hill caught the first morning light in a way that made everything look like it was just starting. She was not going to let them take it. They reached Caldwell Crossing the next afternoon after a morning that involved 2 wrong trails and a river crossing that left both of them cold to the knee. The town was larger than Ridgeback, a proper commercial street with a bank and 2 hotels and a courthouse that had pretensions to grandeur it hadn't quite achieved. The sign over the courthouse door was carved wood, the letters gilded and already starting to flake. Ashford's office is on the main street, Garrick said as they rode in. He'll have people watching. Do you think he expected me to come here? If I were him, I'd have expected it. People who don't fight don't usually get that letter delivered by hand with a date attached. He wants you scared. He wants you to come and either sign or collapse. He's not prepared for someone who comes and starts pulling at the seams. Good, Lena said. They went to the courthouse first. The county clerk in Caldwell Crossing was a different breed from Pettigrew. A wide, comfortable woman named Harriet Doss who moved through her filing room like she owned everything in it and had opinions about all of it. Lena explained what she needed. Harriet pulled a face. Ashford. She said the name the way you'd say the name of a smell. He's got 7 contracts registered in this office in the past 3 years. 3 of them have been challenged. 2 of those challenges are still pending. She looked at Lena steadily. You're wanting to see your contract specifically. Yes. I'll need you to verify identity, and I'll note for the record that you're requesting access as a named party in the agreement, not as a general member of the public. That's correct. Harriet went and got the file. It took 20 minutes. When she came back, she laid the contract on the counter, and Lena read it carefully from beginning to end. It was 11 pages. 3 of those pages were boilerplate that seemed designed to make the document look more substantial than it was. The core of it was contained in about 2 pages of specific language that assigned Lena's property, described by legal parcel number, which was correct, which meant someone who knew the property had helped Ashford write this, to a man named Cyrus Holt as part of a marriage settlement agreement in exchange for the sum of $460, which would be held by Ashford's brokerage as administrative payment. $460. That was what her life had cost them. The witness signatures were on the last page. 2 of them. One was her Uncle Harlan's, exactly as she'd expected. The other was Boyd's, her 18-year-old cousin who'd watched her at the breakfast table with that specific curiosity. And there, at the top of the page, above both of them, a signature for the property owner. The name written there was hers. Lena Mercer, in handwriting that was close but not exactly right, slanted slightly differently than her own. That's not my signature, she said. I didn't think it was, Harriet said from where she was pretending to reorganize a stack of files at the far end of the counter. That's a forged signature. I can hear you saying that. Lena looked up. If I bring in a document with my actual signature for comparison, what's the process for filing a challenge based on document fraud? You'd need to submit a written challenge with supporting evidence to the court clerk. The presiding judge would review it and schedule a hearing. Harriet paused. The presiding judge in this circuit is Judge Amos Reardon. He has a reputation for being thorough. Is that a warning? It's information, Harriet said carefully. Thorough can cut both ways. Lena straightened up. Garrick, who had been standing slightly behind her, reading the contract over her shoulder, said nothing until they were outside. They forged your signature, he said. Yes. That changes the legal picture considerably. It means this isn't just a bad contract made by someone who had partial authority. It's fraud from the starting line. Forged signature, coerced witnesses, fraudulent marital conveyance. She was walking now, fast, thinking while she moved. I need a lawyer who isn't afraid of Ashford. That's a shorter list than you'd like. Is there anyone you trust? He thought about it. There's a man in town named Calhoun. He practiced law in the Eastern Territories for 15 years before he came out here. He's not afraid of much, and he doesn't like Ashford on principle. I've met him twice. Garrick paused. I can't promise he'll take your case. Can you get me in front of him? Yes. Then let's go. Franklin Calhoun kept an office above the hardware store, reachable by an exterior staircase that creaked in a way that probably served as a useful warning system. He was a compact man in his 50s with close-cut gray hair and the habit of looking at whoever he was talking to with an attention that was slightly more focused than comfortable. He looked at the copy Lena had made of the contract notes. Harriet had allowed her to take down the key details by hand, and he looked at Garrick, and then he looked back at Lena. You're saying the signature is forged. I'm saying that's not my handwriting. I can provide samples for comparison. And you have no knowledge of this Cyrus Holt. None whatsoever. Do you know who he is? Calhoun asked Garrick. I know the name. He runs cattle on leased land east of Ridgeback. He's had disputes with 3 neighbors over fence lines in the past 4 years. He's the type that acquires things through whatever combination of legal pressure and money is most efficient. Garrick's voice was neutral. He and Ashford have worked together before. Calhoun folded his hands on his desk. Outside, the afternoon was declining toward evening, and the light was going orange through the single window. If the signature is forged, the contract is void on its face, he said. The question is proving it, and proving it fast enough to have the lien lifted before the scheduled hearing. Judges don't like being asked to unschedule hearings. They especially don't like being put in the position of having to say a document in their court was fraudulent. I know, Lena said. I'm not saying it can't be done. He looked at her steadily. I'm saying it will be unpleasant. Ashford will push back. He has people in this town. Your uncle will likely testify against you. And the fact that Crow here is involved will be used to paint a picture. Some story about a wealthy rancher and a woman of questionable circumstance. I've got questionable circumstance, Lena said. I've also got a forged signature and 2 witnesses who signed under coercion. Boyd is 18, Garrick said. He might be turned. Calhoun looked at him. You think the boy would flip? I think the boy thought he was part of something clever and didn't consider what it meant legally. He's not bright enough to have understood what he was signing as a witness. If someone explained to him clearly that he'd personally signed his name to a document that was fraudulent by law, he might panic, Lena finished. She hadn't thought of Boyd as anything other than a participant, another person who'd looked at her from across that breakfast table and stayed quiet. But she could see the shape of it. Boyd was 18 and stupid, and had thought he was doing his father a favor. Boyd had not probably thought very hard about what happened to witnesses on fraudulent contracts. It's a thread, Calhoun said. He looked at Lena for another moment. Then he said, I'll take the case. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He was already reaching for paper. You both need somewhere to stay tonight that isn't the main hotel, because the main hotel has a clerk who talks. There's a boarding house on the south edge of town, Widow Marsh's place. She doesn't ask questions, and she doesn't volunteer information. He wrote something and slid it across the desk. And tomorrow we start pulling this apart. Lena picked up the address. Outside the creaking staircase window, Caldwell Crossing was settling into its evening rhythms. Horses being tied, lamps being lit, a burst of laughter from somewhere down the street. She thought about her land, the particular creek that ran behind the eastern fence line, the way it sounded in spring when the melt came down from the higher elevations. The corner post she'd replaced herself last April, setting it in concrete she'd mixed by hand because she hadn't wanted to wait for help. She was going to keep it, all of it. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she'd learned something today sitting in that courthouse copying contract language by hand. The people who'd done this to her had been careful, but they hadn't been careful enough. They'd gotten lazy somewhere. They always did. And when she found the exact place where they'd been lazy, she was going to pull on it until the whole thing unraveled. She tucked the address into her coat pocket, next to Ashford's letter. "Tomorrow then," she said. Part 2. The Hunt. The trouble started before sunrise. Lena heard it first by boots on the stairs outside Widow Marsh's boarding house, more than one pair, moving with the specific kind of careful that meant whoever was coming didn't want to be heard. She was already awake. She'd slept badly, the way she always did in unfamiliar places, and she'd been lying in the dark running through contract language in her head when the sound reached her. She was up and dressed in under a minute. She knocked on the wall between her room and Garrick's. 2 short raps, the signal they'd agreed on before turning in. She heard him move immediately, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. She cracked her door and looked out into the narrow hallway. 2 men at the far end, by the stairs. One had a lantern turned low. The other had his hand on a door. Not her door, not Garrick's, but close enough that she understood they were checking rooms. She stepped back and eased her door shut and crossed to the window. 2nd floor. The drop to the ground was about 12 feet, which was manageable if she went out feet first and caught the windowsill on the way down. She'd done worse. Garrick's door opened before she reached the window. He came in without knocking, which under other circumstances she might have had words about. He looked at her, looked at the window, and made the same calculation she had. "How many?" he said, very low. 2 inside. Maybe more outside. Ashford moves fast. Or my uncle sent someone ahead. Garrick went to the window, looked down, looked at the alley below. "There's one in the alley." "Of course there is." He thought for about 2 seconds. "Front of the building. They won't expect it." We'd walk past the 2 inside. If we go now, before they finish checking rooms, they're still in the back hallway. It was not a good plan. It was just the least bad option available, which was a distinction Lena was becoming familiar with. She grabbed her coat and her bag and they went. The hallway was empty when she eased the door open again. She could hear voices from the back stairwell, one of the men saying something she couldn't make out, the other one responding. They moved fast and quiet along the hall toward the front stairs, down, through the entry where Widow Marsh kept a lamp burning low on the table by the door. Lena had a half-second thought that she should leave money for the room, which was absurd given the circumstances, but she was her father's daughter and couldn't quite help it. They went out the front door and into the pre-dawn cold. The street was empty, except for a dog nosing at something near the water trough. They walked, not ran. Running attracted attention in a way walking didn't. Around the side of the building and to where their horses were stabled in a small private barn 2 blocks west that Calhoun had arranged, specifically because putting them at the main livery would have been the obvious choice, and obvious choices in this situation were a liability. They were saddled and out of town inside of 15 minutes. Behind them, through the lightning dark, Lena heard shouting from the direction of the boarding house. She didn't look back. They rode north for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and Caldwell Crossing while the sky went from black to gray to the pale, reluctant pink of early November. Neither of them talked. There wasn't much to say, and the silence was the kind that came from shared urgency rather than discomfort. When they finally stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing, Garrick said, "Calhoun has the information he needs to start the challenge. He doesn't need us there to file it. He needs me available to testify about the signature. Eventually, not today." He watered his horse without looking at her. "Ashford is moving faster than I expected. He had people in Caldwell Crossing already, or he called them in when someone told him you'd arrived and gone straight to the courthouse." "Harriet Doss," Lena said. "She wasn't unfriendly, but she'd have been required to log my request for access to the contract. Which means Ashford had someone checking that log, or someone who told him the moment you pulled that file." He finally looked at her. "He's not just a land broker, Lena. He's got a network. People in courthouse offices, people in hotels, deputies that owe him. This is what he does. He's been doing it for years." She absorbed this. Around them, the creek moved fast and cold, cutting through a bed of pale gravel. The horses drank steadily. "Then we can't go back to Caldwell Crossing," she said. "Not until we have something strong enough to matter. We have the forged signature, which is our word against his until we have the comparison documents and an expert who'll testify to the difference." She sat back in her saddle, thinking. "Boyd, We need to get to Boyd before Harlan has a chance to coach him or scare him into silence. Garrick was quiet for a moment. That means going back toward Ridgeback. That means going back toward where everyone who's looking for us expects us to be. Yes. She looked at the creek. She looked at the hills beyond it, brown and spare in the autumn light. Then she said, "What exactly did they put out on you? The story your uncle's spreading?" Garrick pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. She hadn't known he had it. He held it out and she took it. A handbill, printed on cheap stock, the kind that got tacked up at trading posts and saloons. It had her name and Garrick's name and the words "wanted for inquiry" above descriptions of them both, with a note that Lena Mercer was suspected of having absconded with property belonging to her family, and that Garrick Crow was believed to have aided in this. Absconded with property. She almost laughed. It would have been funny if it weren't so precisely designed, framing her not as a victim, but as a criminal, giving anyone who found them a reason to hold them rather than a reason to help. "Where did you get this?" "Widow Marsh put it under my door last night before we went to sleep. She found it posted at the end of the street." He took it back and folded it. "She didn't say anything to us directly, which I took as a kind of courtesy." "The two men in the hallway this morning, they weren't Ashford's people?" "Could have been either. Harlan moves faster than Ashford. He's local. He knows the roads. Ashford has more reach, but slower response time." He tucked the paper back in his coat. "At this point, it doesn't matter much. The effect is the same." She knew he was right. She also knew, with a cold and quiet certainty that had been building since she walked out of her uncle's house 3 days ago, that the situation was going to get worse before it had any chance of getting better. That was the nature of this kind of thing. You pulled on a thread, and the knot didn't come loose all at once. It tightened first because the people who tied it would pull back. "Tell me about Cyrus Holt," she said. Garrick looked at her. "What do you want to know?" "You said he acquires things through legal pressure and money. That sounds like someone who doesn't have enough of one to do without the other." He considered this. He's got enough money to be dangerous, but not enough land to be comfortable. He runs cattle on lease, which means he's always one bad year away from losing access to grazing. He's been trying to buy his own spread for about 10 years, by most accounts, and he keeps getting outbid or outmaneuvered. A pause. "Your 240 acres with the creek access would be worth considerably more than $460 to someone trying to establish a real cattle operation. And he'd get the land through the marriage agreement? That's how it works?" Marital conveyance is how Ashford frames it legally. The woman's property passes to the husband under the agreement terms, and Ashford takes his brokerage fee off the top. Holt ends up with the land, Ashford ends up with cash, and your uncle ends up with whatever Harlan was paid to cooperate. Garrick's voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it, a kind of contained anger that was different from heat. "It's a clean arrangement, until someone starts picking at it." They moved on after that, heading northeast on a route that kept them off the main trail and in the creek beds and tree lines where they could. The day was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that looked beautiful until you were out in it and realized the wind had a real edge. Lena's coat was good, but not good enough for this, and she spent part of the afternoon riding with her collar up and her jaw tight against the chill. They stopped before dark at a ranch about 14 miles from Ridgeback, a small operation, a family named Kettle that Garrick apparently knew from some past transaction. He didn't explain the connection, and Lena didn't ask. The couple who ran it, a man in his 60s named Walt and his wife Clara, took one look at the handbill they pulled from Garrick's pocket and handed it back with matching expressions of pragmatic disbelief. "Garrick Crow kidnapping a woman," Walt said flatly. "Right, and I'm the governor of the territory." "It's a legal mess," Garrick said. "I'll spare you the details." "I don't need the details. I need to know if you're bringing trouble to my doorstep." "I hope not. We need a night, and we'll move on in the morning." Walt looked at Lena. She held his gaze without flinching. "You're the Mercer girl," he said. "James Mercer's daughter." "Yes." "I knew your father. He was a straight-dealing man." Walt handed the handbill back to Garrick. "You can have the barn. Don't be here when the sun comes up." Clara fed them in the kitchen while the men stayed outside and talked. She put venison stew on the table and didn't say much while Lena ate, but as she was clearing the bowls, she said without particular preamble, "They've been through here, 2 men, this afternoon, asking about a woman traveling with Crow." Lena set down her spoon. What did you tell them? Walt told them he hadn't seen anyone. Clara wiped the edge of the pot with a cloth. Which was true at the time. They didn't push. She looked at Lena squarely. They left a handbill. I know what the handbill says. I expect you do. Clara folded the cloth and set it on the counter. I also expect you know it doesn't say the same thing twice in two tellings. The version those men gave Walt made it sound like you'd stolen money directly from your uncle's house. Not property. Money. Lena absorbed this. They're changing the story as they go. Adjusting it to whoever they're talking to, Clara said, makes it harder to pin down and easier for people to add their own details. She looked out the window toward the barn where the lamp was visible through the gaps in the boards. I'm telling you because you should know they're not just posting handbills. They're talking. And talk spreads faster than writers. Lena thanked her genuinely, not in the automatic way, but in the way you thanked someone who'd given you something real. Garrett came in a few minutes later, smelling of cold air and horses, and she told him what Clara had said. He sat down across from her at the cleared table and was quiet for a moment. If they're changing the story, he said, they're doing it because a single fixed story can be disproved. A moving story is harder to catch. Which means they're expecting us to try to fight it. They're expecting a legal challenge. What they're not expecting is the challenge to come with enough documentation to be credible before they've finished setting up their defense. He looked at his hands on the table. Calhoun can file the signature challenge, but we need Boyd. I've been thinking about Boyd, Lena said. And? Boyd is 18. He doesn't understand what he signed, but he does understand his father. She met Garrick's eyes. Harlan is driving this. Harlan found Ashford, or Ashford found Harlan, and the two of them put the arrangement together. Boyd signed because his father told him to, and he wanted to be useful. She paused. That means Boyd is scared right now. Not because he's been caught. He thinks he's on the winning side. He's scared because something went sideways from what he expected. What do you mean? He expected me to take the letter and fold, or fight and lose. He didn't expect me to disappear. Lena leaned forward slightly. Scared people make decisions. Boyd is going to do one of two things. He's going to double down and get louder, or he's going to start looking for a door. Garrett considered. How do we know which one he's doing? We don't. But if we can get to him before Harlan does, when there's no one watching and no position to maintain... She stopped. Thought. Boyd once came to me when he was 15 and broke a fence line on the east side of my property. He didn't tell his father. He came to me directly and told me what happened and offered to fix it. She'd forgotten that until now. He wasn't a bad kid at 15. 3 years is a long time. It is. She didn't argue that. But people don't change completely. The part of him that came to me at 15 is still in there somewhere. And he knows, on some level, that he put his name on a document that said his cousin signed something she never signed. Garrick sat back in his chair. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving around the corners of the house with a low, persistent sound. The lamp on the table flickered once and settled. There's a general store in Millhaven, he said. About 6 miles from your uncle's spread. Boyd rides there on Thursdays for feed and supplies. I've seen him there twice in the past month. If tomorrow's Thursday, it is, then he'll be in Millhaven by mid-morning. She thought about it. Millhaven was 11 miles from where they were sitting. 11 miles in the morning dark, arriving before Boyd, finding a place that was neutral enough that Boyd wouldn't feel cornered, but private enough that he could say something true without an audience. All right, she said. They slept in the barn that night, in the hay above the horse stalls, which was warmer than she'd expected and smelled like animals and dry grass, and a season almost over. She lay on her back and stared at the roof boards and thought about Boyd at 15, red-faced and sheepish, explaining about the fence post he'd knocked over with his father's wagon. I'll fix it, he'd said. I just didn't want my pa to know. She hoped some version of that boy still existed. She needed him to. The wind moved through the barn and the horses shifted below, and the dark held still and cold around everything, and eventually she slept. Boyd Mercer was loading feed sacks into the back of a wagon when Lena stepped out of the narrow gap between the Millhaven General Store and the building next to it. He saw her and went completely still. The feed sack dropped back onto the wagon bed with a dull thud. For a moment he just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking like a man who'd been expecting something bad and was now doing the math on how bad exactly. Boyd, she said. Lana. His voice came out wrong. Too high, too quick. He looked past her, scanning the street. Is Crow with you? He's nearby. Boyd's jaw worked. He was 18 and trying very hard to look like he wasn't scared, which mostly meant he looked scared and tired at the same time. He'd lost some weight since she'd seen him at the breakfast table. Or maybe it was just the cold, and the way cold made everyone look a little thinner and more worn than they actually were. You shouldn't be here, he said. Pa's got men watching the roads. Then I'm lucky I didn't come by road. She stepped closer, keeping her voice low. The street behind her was quiet. Mid-morning in Millhaven, a handful of people going about their business, no one paying them particular attention yet. I need to talk to you. 5 minutes. Not here. He hesitated. She could see the argument happening inside him, the competing pulls of loyalty to his father and something older and less certain than loyalty. Then he tied the horse's lead to the post and followed her around the side of the building. Garrick was already there, standing against the back wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. Boyd stopped when he saw him. He's not going to do anything, Lena said. We came to talk. Pa says he kidnapped you. Do I look kidnapped, Boyd? The boy looked at her carefully. He was Harlan's son in his face and jaw, but something around his eyes was different, softer, or maybe just less settled. He hadn't lived long enough to harden all the way through. No, he admitted. Good, because I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to hear it as someone who understands what it means for you personally. She kept her voice even. You signed a document as a witness. In that document, my signature appears at the top, giving my consent to a marital conveyance agreement. I did not sign that document. I was never consulted. My name was put there without my knowledge. Boyd's face did something complicated. Pa said, I don't care what your pa said. I'm asking you what you know. She held his gaze. Did you see me sign anything, ever? In any context? A long pause. The wind moved through the alley and kicked up a small spiral of dust near Garrick's boots. No, Boyd said quietly. Then you signed as a witness to something you didn't witness, which makes your signature on that document a legal problem, not your father's problem, yours. You're 18, Boyd. That's old enough to be held accountable. He swallowed. I didn't know that's what I was. I know you didn't understand all of it. That's the one thing working in your favor. She took a breath. There's a lawyer in Caldwell Crossing named Calhoun. He's filing a challenge to the contract on grounds of forged signature and fraud. When that challenge goes to hearing, the judge is going to look at every name on that document, and a witness who comes forward voluntarily and explains what they understood and didn't understand at the time of signing will be treated very differently than a witness who has to be compelled. Boyd looked at the ground, then at Garrick, then back at Lena. Pa will lose everything, he said. Not defensively. More like he was trying to understand the full shape of it. Your father made choices, she said. You didn't make the same choice. You can still decide what side of this you're on. It wasn't a clean moment. Boyd didn't suddenly straighten up and declare himself. He stood there in the cold alley looking like a kid who'd followed someone into a situation he didn't fully understand and was only now seeing where it led. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at his boots. Then he said, What do you need me to do? Lena glanced at Garrick. Garrick unfolded his arms and reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, a letter, already written, that Calhoun had prepared 2 days ago on the possibility that Boyd could be reached. You read it, Garrick said. If it's accurate to what you know, you sign it. We get it to Calhoun before the end of the week. Boyd took the letter, read it slowly. His lips moved slightly on a few of the harder words. When he finished, he looked up. This says I didn't observe the owner's signature being executed. Is that true? Yeah. He folded the letter, unfolded it. Yeah, it's true. He signed it against the side wall of the building, using the flat surface as a desk, with a pencil Garrick produced from the same coat pocket. His handwriting was large and slightly unsteady, the writing of someone who didn't do it often. When he handed the paper back, he didn't look at either of them. Boyd, Lena said. He looked up. Get out from under your father on this. Whatever he promised you, it's not worth what comes next. He nodded once, tightly, and went back around to the street without another word. They heard the wagon move a few minutes later, the creak of the boards and the horse's hooves on packed dirt, heading away from the store, not back the way he'd come. "He'll tell Harlan," Garrick said. "Probably, but not today." She folded Boyd's signed letter and put it with the other papers in her bag. "Today, he needs to decide what kind of person he is. That takes a little while." Well, they sent Boyd's letter to Calhoun by a writer Garrick trusted, a man named Seb who worked one of the outlying farms and owed Garrick a favor from some past business, and asked no questions about the package he was handed. Getting the letter to Calhoun without riding into Caldwell Crossing themselves was the careful move. Getting the letter to Calhoun fast was the necessary one, because Lena had done the math on the hearing date, and they had 8 days, and 8 days was not a lot of room. While they waited for word back from Calhoun, they kept moving. They stayed 2 nights at an abandoned line shack on the north edge of Garrick's own territory, a small, cold building that smelled like mice and disuse, but had a stove that still functioned and walls that cut the wind. It was the kind of place you appreciated only in contrast to the outdoors. On the second night, Garrick told her about Ashford's operation. Not just what he'd told her before, the outline, the pattern, but the specifics he'd learned from the investigator he'd hired months ago. He laid it out carefully, the way a man lays out a hand of cards he's been holding for a while and has been waiting for the right game to play them in. Ashford had been operating in the territory for 6 years. In that time, he'd executed or attempted to execute 11 property acquisitions using variants of the same scheme: a contact inside the target family or community, a forged or coerced signature, a filed contract that created enough legal ambiguity to buy time, and then a combination of pressure and delay to wear down anyone who tried to fight back. Of his 11 attempts, 7 had succeeded. 3 had been abandoned when the target found resources he hadn't anticipated. 1, the attempt on Garrick's homesteaders, had been fought to a draw. The 7 successes had generated substantial returns. Ashford didn't just take his brokerage fee. He held the properties briefly through shell arrangements and then sold them at significant markup to larger land interests that were themselves consolidated under a holding company registered out of the Eastern Territories. The holding company had connections to a railroad speculation group that was quietly acquiring land along a projected rail corridor running northeast across the territory. Lena sat with this for a moment. He's not just doing this for himself. He's a middleman, Garrick said, a very well-compensated one. The real money is in the land consolidation, buying parcels cheap through fraud and selling them to interests that need the corridor cleared. Which means someone above Ashford knows exactly what's happening. Almost certainly. I've never been able to get documentation of who that is. My investigator got as far as the holding company name before the trail went cold. Garrick was quiet for a moment. But if we pull Ashford's operation apart publicly, not just your case, but the pattern of it, it puts pressure all the way up the chain. People with money and legal standing in these arrangements don't like exposure. They cut loose the people below them. Lena understood what he was saying. If they fought only her case, they might win her land back. If they exposed the whole pattern, they might break the entire network. The first was personal. The second was something larger. "You've been sitting on this information for 4 months," she said. "I've been waiting for the right circumstances," he said. A single aggrieved rancher making accusations about a land broker looks like a grudge. A documented pattern of fraud affecting multiple landowners, with a forged signature as the centerpiece, looks different. It looks like evidence. Yes. She thought about the other 6 families who'd lost their land, whether they were still in the territory or gone, whether they even knew they'd been defrauded, or if they'd simply believed they'd had bad luck. She thought about Calhoun in his office above the hardware store, probably working through the challenge filing right now, probably not yet knowing the full scale of what he was dealing with. "We need to go back to Caldwell Crossing," she said. "We've been through this. It's not safe. Not the way we went before. Not quietly, trying to stay under notice." She looked at him directly. "We walk in publicly. We go to Calhoun and we give him everything you have, the holding company, the pattern, the 7 prior acquisitions. We file it all together as part of the challenge." She paused. "And we do it in front of as many people as possible, in the open, in daylight." Garrick was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind was doing something low and continuous against the walls. "That's a considerable risk," he said. "I know. If Ashford moves to have us detained before the filing is complete, we lose the advantage. Everything I have stays out of the court record, and he has time to bury it." What's the alternative? She said. We keep moving, keep hiding, and let Calhoun fight this with what he has? Boyd's letter helps. The signature comparison helps. But it's still one case, and Ashford has lawyers and time and money and people who owe him favors across this whole territory. She leaned forward slightly. The only thing he doesn't have is the truth in public. The moment that's in public, in front of people, he can't make it go away. Garrick looked at the stove. He looked at his hands. He had the manner of a man who is accustomed to managing situations carefully, to controlling the variables, to never walking into anything without knowing his exits. And she was asking him to walk in with no exits and trust that the truth was enough. There's one more thing, he said. What? He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small bundle of papers, folded and tied with string. He set it on the table between them. My investigator found 3 of the 7 families that Ashford successfully defrauded, he said. Over the past 4 months, I've made contact with all 3. 2 of them have written statements describing how the scheme worked in their cases. Coercion, forged documentation, the same shell arrangement to move the land. He looked at her. They've been waiting for someone to do something with these. She looked at the bundle. It was not a large stack of paper, but she understood what it represented. 3 other families who'd been through something like what she was going through, who'd lost and hadn't known how to fight back, who'd been waiting in whatever was left of their lives for someone to pick up what they'd set down. Why didn't you file these yourself 4 months ago, before any of this? Because I had the documents, but not the standing, he said. I wasn't a victim. I was a neighbor who'd gotten curious. A judge looks at that and sees a grudge. He met her eyes. You're the victim. You have the forged signature. You have the active case. You're the one who can walk into that courthouse and make it stick. She picked up the bundle, untied the string, looked at the first page of the first statement, handwritten in the careful script of someone who'd taken their time over every word. My name is Edna Colworth, she read. In the spring of 3 years past, I received correspondence from a man named Doyle Ashford. She stopped reading. She'd gotten what she needed from the first sentence. All right, she said. All right, we go to Caldwell Crossing? We go to Caldwell Crossing. We go public. We give Calhoun everything and we file it all at once. She retied the string around the papers and put them carefully in her bag. When? Day after tomorrow. We'll need to get word to Calhoun first. He'll need to be ready to receive the filing immediately, because once Ashford knows we're there, he'll move to block it. Can we get word to him without tipping Ashford? Garrick thought. Walt Kettle's boy makes a supply run to Caldwell Crossing every week. He's not involved in any of this and has no reason to be watched. If I write a letter tonight and we ride to the Kettle place in the morning, do it. He wrote the letter by lamplight while she went through the 3 witness statements carefully, reading every word and making notes on a spare piece of paper about dates, locations, and specific language that matched the patterns in her own case. By the time she was finished, her notes filled most of the page. The picture it built was clear and specific and damning. Not just Ashford's method, but his consistency, the almost mechanical repetition of it, the way each case had the same bones even when the surface details differed. She thought about walking into the Caldwell Crossing courthouse in broad daylight with all of this in her hands. She thought about what Ashford would do when he understood what was happening. She thought about Harlan, who had sat across a breakfast table and told her the arrangement was already done, the money already spent. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was something more specific than fear, a kind of focused alertness that came from knowing the exact shape of a dangerous thing and deciding to walk toward it anyway. She'd felt it once before, when she'd been 16 and her father's barn had caught fire in the night, and she'd gone in twice for the horses before the roof came down. She'd been terrified both times, but terror hadn't stopped her legs from moving. Her legs were still moving now. Garrick sealed the letter with the lamp wax and set it on the table. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we ride. She lay down on her coat in the corner of the line shack and closed her eyes. The stove ticked. The wind ran along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, very faint, she thought she heard a coyote, one long, wavering note that rose and then fell away into the dark. She thought about the Colworth woman who'd taken her time over every word of that statement, the care in it, the way you wrote something like that when you wanted someone, someday, to actually read it. Someone was reading it. She was going to make sure it counted, They rode into Caldwell Crossing at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was market day, which meant the main street was busy enough that two riders coming in from the north didn't immediately draw every eye. Garrick had chosen the day deliberately. Crowds were inconvenient for people trying to do things quietly. Calhoun was waiting for them. He'd gotten the letter through Walt Kettle's boy 2 days prior and had spent the intervening time doing exactly what Garrick had asked, preparing the consolidated filing, organizing the witness statements, arranging for a handwriting expert named Dr. Prudence Vance, who worked out of the territorial capital and happened to be passing through the region on other business, and had agreed, for a fee Garrick paid without discussion, to provide a professional comparison of the signatures. Lena and Garrick came through the back of the hardware store and up the interior stairs to Calhoun's office, which was not how you normally entered, but normal had stopped applying several days ago. Calhoun had coffee on and a stack of papers on his desk that looked like the product of serious and sustained work. Dr. Vance was already there, a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had given expert testimony enough times to find the drama of courtrooms mildly tedious. "The signatures don't match," Dr. Vance said, before Lena had fully gotten through the door. "The pressure pattern is different. The slant is off by approximately 12 degrees, and the loop formation on the capital M is inconsistent with every other sample of Miss Mercer's handwriting I've examined. I can testify to this under oath without reservation." "Good morning to you too," Lena said. Dr. Vance almost smiled. "Good morning. I've been looking at these samples since yesterday evening. I don't like wasting time on pleasantries when there's a clear finding." Calhoun spread the papers on his desk. "Here's where we stand. I have the consolidated challenge filing ready. It incorporates the signature fraud, Boyd Mercer's witness statement, and the 3 prior victim declarations. I've also attached a summary of the holding company connections that Crow's investigator documented, with a request that the court compel Ashford to produce his full brokerage records for the past 6 years. He looked up. "Judge Reardon is scheduled to hold a preliminary review this afternoon at 2 o'clock. That was set before any of this. When we walk in there with this filing, it changes the nature of the proceeding considerably." "How will Reardon respond to that?" Garrick asked. "Unpredictably," Calhoun said, which was honest. "He's thorough, as I told Miss Mercer before. He doesn't like surprises, and he doesn't like being manipulated. He also doesn't like fraud, not because he's particularly noble, but because fraud in his courtroom reflects on his record, and he cares about his record." He tapped the filing. "If we present this cleanly and completely, he'll take it seriously. If he thinks we're grandstanding or trying to embarrass him, he'll shut it down." "We present it cleanly," Lena said. "That's the plan." Calhoun paused. "There is one other thing. Ashford knows you're in town. I don't know how. Possibly someone on the street saw you ride in. I received a message from his legal representative about an hour ago requesting that the 2 o'clock proceeding be postponed pending what they called clarification of certain evidentiary matters. He wants more time," Garrick said. "He wants enough time to file an injunction blocking the consolidated challenge, or to arrange for the two of you to be detained before 2 o'clock on some pretext." Calhoun straightened his stack of papers. "Sheriff Braddock has been in contact with Ashford's people this week. I don't know where Braddock lands on all of this, but I wouldn't count on his neutrality." Lena thought about Cord Braddock, the heavy-set sheriff she'd known by sight from her years of occasional visits to Ridgeback. Fair when convenient, flexible when it wasn't. "If Braddock tries to detain us before the hearing, then we need to be inside that courtroom before he gets the opportunity," Calhoun said. "Which means we go now, not at 2. I'll file for an emergency preliminary review on grounds of imminent evidence destruction. Reardon won't like it, but it's within procedure." Lena looked at Garrick. Garrick looked at the stack of papers on Calhoun's desk. Something in his face settled into the expression she'd come to recognize over the past week. Not calm exactly, but a kind of resolved stillness, the way a man looked when he'd accepted the terms of a situation and stopped calculating exits. "Let's go," he said. The Caldwell Crossing Courthouse at 11 in the morning was not empty, which was either fortunate or dangerous, depending on how the next hour went. There were people in the main hall. A land dispute between 2 ranchers scheduled for later in the day, a few lawyers conferring in corners, the general low-level traffic of a working courthouse. The gilded letters on the sign above the door had flaked a little more since Lena had last looked at them. Calhoun went first, with the filing under his arm and Dr. Vance beside him. Lena and Garrick followed. The walk across the courthouse hall to the clerk's window felt longer than it was, the way distances stretched when you were aware of being watched. And they were being watched. She could feel it in the way conversations paused and then resumed, in the specific quality of the glances that came from the corners of the room. The clerk at the window, not Harriet Doss, someone younger and less certain, took the emergency filing from Calhoun and looked at it the way people looked at things they didn't know how to categorize. "I'll need to bring this to the judge." "Please do," Calhoun said. "We'll wait." They waited by the window. 3 minutes passed, then 5. Then the young clerk came back and said, with the expression of a man who'd been handed a problem he hadn't anticipated on a Wednesday, that Judge Reardon would see them in chambers in 15 minutes. Ashford's people arrived at 12 minutes. There were 2 of them. A lawyer named Greer that Lena had never seen before, with a polished suit and the kind of confidence that came from operating in environments where confidence was a currency, and behind him, Doyle Ashford himself. She'd built a picture of Ashford in her head from the letter and the contract and everything Garrick had told her. The real man was somewhat different from the picture. He was medium height, neatly dressed, with a face that wasn't threatening so much as watchful. A man who had learned to read rooms and found them generally manageable. He looked at Lena with the specific expression of someone who has encountered an inconvenience they expected to resolve before this point and are now recalculating. "Miss Mercer," Greer said, addressing her rather than Calhoun. "My client is prepared to discuss a resolution to this matter that would satisfy all parties. There's no need to involve the court." "There's a forged signature on your client's contract," Calhoun said. "There's need to involve the court." "The signature question is a matter of interpretation." "Dr. Vance," Calhoun said. Dr. Vance stepped forward and introduced herself to Greer with the flat efficiency of someone who testified professionally. "The signature on the document filed by your client is not consistent with the handwriting of Lena Mercer across 12 comparison samples. I am prepared to testify to this in detail." Greer looked at her. He looked at Ashford. Ashford's face hadn't changed much, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A recalculation happening in real time, the kind that happened when a man who was accustomed to controlling situations encountered a variable he hadn't accounted for. "This is an ambush," Greer said to Calhoun. "You've arranged this." "I've filed an emergency preliminary review on grounds of imminent fraud," Calhoun said. "That's a legal procedure. You're welcome to participate." The door to Reardon's chambers opened at that moment, and the clerk appeared to bring them in. The timing was not elegant. All of them crowded toward the door at once, Ashford and Greer attempting to position themselves as the primary parties. Calhoun holding his ground with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd been practicing law for 30 years and did not move for people who hadn't earned it. Judge Amos Reardon was a lean man in his late 60s with white hair and reading glasses that he wore at the very end of his nose in a way that allowed him to look either through them or over them depending on how much patience he had for what he was looking at. He looked at the assembled group over the top of his glasses. "This is not a hearing," he said immediately. "This is a chambers review. Everyone sits down and nobody says anything until I tell them to." Everyone sat down. Reardon read the filing for the better part of 20 minutes. Nobody spoke. Ashford's lawyer tried once, and Reardon held up a hand without looking up, and Greer stopped. The only sound was the occasional turn of a page, and distantly the sounds of the courthouse going about its business outside the closed door. When Reardon finally set the document down, he took his glasses off and looked at Lena. "You're the property owner," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you contend this signature is not yours." "It is not my signature." "Dr. Vance." He looked at her. "You've examined the samples." "I have, Your Honor. The signature on the filed contract is not consistent with the genuine handwriting of Lena Mercer." Reardon looked at Greer. "Counselor, does your client dispute that contention?" Greer started to say something carefully constructed. Reardon stopped him. "Not the legal argument. I'm asking whether your client disputes that the handwriting expert's finding is technically accurate." A pause. Greer looked at Ashford. Ashford was looking at the desk in front of him with the expression of a man making a decision under pressure that he hadn't wanted to make today. "We dispute the relevance of the finding in the context of the broader contractual—" "That's the legal argument," Reardon said. "I said I didn't want that yet." He put his glasses back on and looked at Calhoun. The prior declarations, you have 3. Yes, Your Honor. 3 former property owners who described the same scheme operating in substantially the same manner. And the holding company documentation. Summary documentation, yes, with a request for compelled disclosure of full brokerage records. Reardon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers in front of him. Then he looked at Ashford directly, over the top of his glasses, in the way that used the glasses as an instrument of attention rather than vision. Mr. Ashford, he said, you have operated in this jurisdiction for 6 years. Yes, Your Honor. In that time, you filed 11 contracts through this and neighboring courthouses. My business involves property transactions, yes. 7 of those contracts resulted in property changing hands under circumstances that, if these declarations are accurate, involved coercion or document fraud. Reardon set down his pen. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you or anyone working on your behalf add the signature of Lena Mercer to the contract filed in this court? The room was very quiet. Ashford looked at his lawyer. Greer put a hand on his arm slightly. On advice of counsel, Greer said, my client declines to answer that question pending. Fine, Reardon said. He wrote something. We'll move to formal hearing. Today, 2 o'clock as scheduled, expanded scope to address the consolidated filing. He looked at Greer. Your client will produce his full brokerage records for the past 6 years. I'm issuing a compelled disclosure order now. If those records are not available at 2 o'clock, I will draw the inference that they contain material your client does not wish the court to see. Greer began to object. Reardon looked at him with the specific patience of someone who had been looked at more times than he could count with that particular expression. Counselor, he said, I've read this filing. I've read 3 sworn declarations describing the same mechanism in the same operational pattern. I have an expert saying this signature is forged. I have a witness statement from a party to the original document saying he did not observe the property owner's signature being executed. He paused. I am being thorough. That is what I do. You will want to prepare your client for the possibility that thorough is not going to serve his interests today. Greer closed his mouth. They filed out of chambers. In the hallway, Ashford walked slightly ahead of his lawyer, and as he passed Lena, he stopped for just a moment. He didn't say anything aggressive. He looked at her with that watchful, calculating face and said, very quietly, You understand this doesn't end here. I'm counting on that, she said. He moved on. Garrick, who had been standing to her left, said nothing, but she felt him shift his weight slightly, the small, involuntary movement of a person who has restrained themselves from saying something they decided not to say. He's going to try to delay the records production, Garrick said when Ashford was out of earshot. He's going to try a lot of things between now and 2 o'clock, Calhoun said. He was already moving toward the main doors, which is why we're not going to stand here discussing it. What? The 2 o'clock hearing was not orderly. Lena had expected something more formal, the kind of courtroom proceeding she'd seen described in newspaper accounts, with measured statements and procedural calm. What she got was closer to a controlled unraveling, the kind that happened when a structure was holding together through habit, and the habit was suddenly interrupted. Ashford's records arrived 20 minutes late and incomplete. Reardon noted both facts on the record without expression. Greer argued procedural objections to every piece of evidence Calhoun introduced, and Reardon sustained approximately none of them. Dr. Vance testified for 35 minutes about the signature and did not once look uncertain or defensive, which was exactly the quality you wanted in an expert witness. Then Harlan Mercer arrived. Lena hadn't known he was coming. She suspected Ashford's people had called him in. A family member willing to testify could complicate the picture, create the impression of a domestic dispute rather than a fraud, muddy the water enough to delay resolution. Harlan came in through the back of the courtroom and sat in the gallery, and when Greer requested he be called as a witness, Reardon allowed it. She watched her uncle take the stand. He looked older than he had at the breakfast table, though it had only been a week. He sat with his back straight in the way of a man who was holding himself together through posture because the other methods were failing. Greer's questions were designed to paint a picture of a concerned family member attempting to secure his niece's future. Harlan played the role with the specific skill of someone who had been telling himself this version of the story long enough to halfway believe it. He talked about Lena's isolation, her difficulties managing the land, his genuine concern for her welfare. Calhoun let him finish. Then he stood up. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you signed the contract as a witness." "I did." "Did you observe Lena Mercer sign the document?" A pause. Just a moment, but the kind of moment that had weight. The family discussed the arrangement. "Did you observe Lena Mercer sign the document, yes or no?" Harlan's jaw tightened. The process was handled by Mr. Ashford, so the answer is no. You did not personally witness her signature being executed. "I witnessed the arrangement being, the document says witness to signature," Calhoun said. "Not witness to arrangement. Did you understand what you were signing as a witness?" Another pause. In the gallery, people who had drifted in from the hall, drawn by the specific quality of noise that a proceeding making history generated, even a small history, sat very still. "I understood we were formalizing it. Did anyone show you Lena Mercer's signature on that document before you signed?" Harlan looked at Ashford, who was seated at the defendant's table with his hands folded and his face composed into something carefully neutral. He looked back at Calhoun, and something in his expression shifted. Not remorse exactly, more like exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying a story that didn't quite fit anymore. "No," he said, "no one showed me her signature." The room did a thing that rooms did when something definitive had been said. A small collective exhale, a shift in the quality of the attention, like a weather change. Greer was on his feet with an objection. Reardon overruled it without appearing to particularly consider it. Calhoun sat down. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had built something carefully and was watching it hold weight. Lena sat still. She looked at her uncle on the witness stand, and she felt a complicated mix of things she didn't have simple names for. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to understanding. Harlan had made choices from a place of smallness, from years of resenting what he didn't have, and deciding that taking it was the same as deserving it. That was not a forgivable thing, but it was a recognizable one. The proceedings ran until nearly 5 o'clock. By the end of them, Reardon had issued a preliminary finding of document fraud, ordered the lien on Lena's property lifted immediately pending final ruling, compelled full production of Ashford's brokerage records within 72 hours, and referred the matter of the prior acquisitions to the Territorial Attorney's Office for independent investigation. Ashford was escorted from the courthouse by 2 of Reardon's bailiffs, not under arrest. The arrest would come later, when the records were examined and the attorney's office had built its case, but under the specific and visible courtesy of men who had been told not to let him leave town. Greer filed 4 motions in the subsequent 20 minutes. Reardon denied 3 of them and held the 4th under advisement with an expression that suggested he hadn't decided whether it deserved the advisement. Calhoun gathered his papers in the emptying courtroom with the unhurried manner of someone who had done what they came to do. Garrick stood near the back wall, where he'd positioned himself at the start of the proceedings and had stayed without moving for 3 hours. Lena sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after everyone else had begun to file out. The courtroom was old wood and high windows, and the last of the afternoon light coming in at a low angle, catching the dust that had been disturbed by the afternoon's work and turning it briefly visible, briefly golden, before it settled again. She thought about Edna Colworth, who had taken her time over every word of her statement. Somewhere in this territory, that woman was going about whatever remained of her life, a life that had been diminished by the same mechanism, the same careful legal packaging of theft. The attorney's office investigation wouldn't give her back what she'd lost. It was too late for that. But it would mean the record showed what had happened. It would mean someone had looked directly at it and called it what it was. That mattered. Lena believed that, even if she couldn't have explained exactly why. She stood up and straightened her coat and picked up her bag. Garrick was at the back of the room. He looked at her when she walked toward him, and there was something in his expression she hadn't quite seen before. Something quieter than the focused steadiness she'd come to recognize, something that sat underneath it. Relief, maybe? Or the specific feeling of having done something that had cost a real price and finding, afterward, that the price had been worth paying. "It's not finished," she said, because she needed to say it to someone. "No," he agreed, "but it's different now than it was this morning." She nodded. She looked at the doors at the back of the courtroom, the ones that opened out into the hall, and beyond that to the street, and beyond that to the road north that led, eventually, back to her land. "Let's get out of here," she said. They walked out into what was left of the day. The ride back to Ridgeback took 2 days, and neither of them was in a hurry. That surprised Lena when she noticed it. For the past week, she'd been moving fast out of necessity, making decisions in compressed windows, sleeping in barns and line shacks, and calculating distances and risks over cold food and low fires. Now the urgency had lifted, not completely, not permanently, but enough that she could feel the difference in her own body, a loosening in the shoulders that she hadn't been aware of carrying until it began to ease. She still had a final ruling to wait for. The attorney's office investigation was just beginning. Ashford's records hadn't been fully examined yet. There were threads still loose and things still unresolved, but the lien on her land was lifted. Reardon's preliminary finding was on record. And something had happened in that courtroom that couldn't be undone. Something had been said, publicly, in front of people, by a judge who cared about his record. The shape of the situation had changed in a way that made the remaining steps feel like work rather than emergency. They rode north through country that was austere and beautiful in the way that late autumn made things. Stripped of color but clarified by it, every line clean against the gray sky. The creek beds were running higher from recent rain. The grass had gone the brown gold color it got when the season had fully turned. Garrick rode beside her mostly in silence, which was a kind of company she'd come to value over the past week. He wasn't a man who filled silence because silence made him uncomfortable. He filled it when he had something to say, and otherwise let it be. And she'd learned that the things he chose to say in the spaces between silence were generally worth the wait. On the afternoon of the first day, somewhere in the open stretch north of the creek crossing, he said, "What are you going to do with the land?" She thought about it. It was not a question she'd let herself fully consider. She'd been too focused on keeping it to think carefully about what having it back would mean. "Work it," she said. "What I've been doing." "Alone?" "Same as before." He was quiet. Then, "The east fence line. You said you replaced a post last April." "2 posts. The third one's going to need it by spring." "You'll need help with the third one." "I'll find help." He looked out at the horizon for a moment, then back at the trail. The gray horse moved steadily under him, unhurried. "I've got a man on my spread who's looking for work. He's reliable and he knows fence line repair. I could send him over in the spring if you needed." She looked at him sideways. He wasn't looking at her. His profile was steady and gave nothing away, which by now she'd learned to read as a specific kind of giving something away. "That's a practical offer," she said. "It's a practical situation." She let it sit for a moment. "I'll think about it." "Fair enough?" They rode on. The sky got heavier toward evening, and it looked like it might snow. Just a threat, the season not quite ready to commit. And they stopped for the night at a trading post where nobody had heard of either of them, or at least pretended not to, and ate warm food at a table that wasn't borrowed and slept in rooms that didn't require an escape plan. In the morning, the sky had cleared and there was frost on everything. The world crystallized and sharp-edged in the early light. They broke camp without ceremony and rode the remaining distance to Ridgeback. The town knew they were coming before they arrived. That was the nature of small places. Information moved through them faster than horses, carried on whatever invisible current connected one person's knowledge to another's. By the time Lena and Garrick rode down the main street, people were already watching from the boardwalks and the doorways of shops, with a specific quality of attention that a community gave to something it had been following without being officially informed of. Sheriff Cord Braddock was standing in front of his office when they rode past. He was a heavy-set man with a face that had learned to be unreadable. He looked at them. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded once. Not warm, not unfriendly, the nod of a man who had understood which way a situation had resolved and was adjusting his position accordingly. Garrick nodded back. Lena didn't. She wasn't inclined toward generosity with Braddock. He hadn't actively worked against them, as far as she knew. But he'd been in contact with Ashford's people, and he hadn't volunteered any help either, and there was a specific kind of failure that lived in the middle, in the space between opposition and assistance. Braddock had occupied that space and found it comfortable, and that told her something about the kind of man he was that she didn't need to pretend not to know. They went to Calhoun's contact in Ridgeback, a paralegal named Doris, who kept copies of the court documents and maintained communication with the Caldwell Crossing office. Doris was a woman in her 40s with ink-stained fingers and the manner of someone who had worked in legal offices long enough to have seen everything and formed opinions about most of it. Reardon's final ruling is expected within the week, she said, flipping through correspondence on her desk. Based on the preliminary finding and the records that Ashford's office was compelled to produce, Calhoun believes the ruling will be in your favor. She looked at Lena over the top of the papers. He also says to tell you that the attorney's office contacted him yesterday. They're treating the prior acquisitions case as a serious investigation. How serious? Serious enough to send 2 people from the territorial capital. She set the papers down. That's the kind of serious that means they think there's a case worth making, not just a case worth being seen to look into. Lena absorbed this. And the holding company? That's where it gets complicated. Doris folded her hands on the desk. The holding company is registered under a law firm name in the Eastern Territories. Unraveling who's actually behind it takes time and authority that Calhoun's office alone doesn't have. The attorney's office does. She paused. There are people above Ashford in this arrangement who have considerably more to lose than he does. Those people will use every legal tool available to slow the investigation down. But they can't stop it. They can delay it, months possibly. Some of it might take years. She looked at Lena steadily. I'm telling you so you know what it actually looks like, not the version where everything resolves cleanly by Christmas. I appreciate that, Lena said. She did, genuinely. She had never been a woman who wanted comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, even when the truth was inconvenient. Her father had been the same way. He used to say that the kindest thing you could do for someone was to give them accurate information about the situation they were actually in, because decisions made on bad information were how people ended up in the worst kinds of trouble. She walked out of Doris's office into the Ridgeback afternoon carrying this information carefully, the way you carried something that had sharp edges. The investigation would take time. Some of the people above Ashford might never be fully brought to account, protected by distance and money and legal complexity. The 7 families who'd lost land to the scheme might not all get it back. Some of those properties had changed hands multiple times since Ashford moved them, and untangling that required courts and precedents and patience on a scale that individual people could not sustain. These were real things. She was not going to pretend they weren't, but the lien on her land was lifted. The fraud was on record. 3 families had given sworn statements that would become part of an official investigation. Boyd had signed a letter that would follow him and perhaps remind him, for the rest of his life, of the moment he'd had a choice. And Harlan had sat on a witness stand and, under the specific pressure of a direct question from a man who didn't want the legal argument, had told a truth he hadn't planned to tell. None of that was nothing. Not even close to nothing. Garrick's ranch was northeast of Ridgeback, about 18 miles, on land that he'd been building for 15 years. She'd never seen it. She knew it by reputation the way she'd known everything about Garrett Crow, as something that existed in the general description of the region without specific detail. He didn't invite her there directly. What he said 2 days after they returned to Ridgeback was that he was riding back that afternoon and that the route went within 3 miles of her property line, and that if she wanted company for part of the ride, she was welcome to it. She rode with him as far as the eastern boundary of her land, where an old post marked the corner of the parcel. The post was weathered gray and leaning slightly east from years of freeze-thaw cycles working at the ground around it. She would need to reset it in the spring. They stopped there. Her land spread out to the west and north, rolling grass and the line of the creek visible in the middle distance. The tree, break that marked the far boundary, the slight rise in the northeast corner where her father had once talked about building a second structure that he never got around to building. She knew every feature of it, the way you knew a face you'd looked at for years. Not because it was dramatic or spectacular, but because you'd been paying attention long enough that the details had accumulated into something like fluency. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't been fully aware was tight. Not relief exactly. She'd felt the relief in the Caldwell Crossing courtroom. This was something quieter and more settled, something that was less about crisis resolved and more about place recognized. This is it, she said. It was not a meaningful statement. She said it because sometimes you needed to say the simple thing out loud. Yeah, Garrick said. He was looking at the land with her, not at her. That was right. This wasn't his moment. He understood that without being told, which told her something significant about him. They sat there for a moment in the cold afternoon air. Then she said, "About that fencing man, He looked at her. Send him in the spring, for the posts. She held his gaze. The east line has 3 that need attention, and the northeast corner has 1 that's nearly gone. If he knows what he's doing, he can assess the rest of the line while he's at it. Garrick nodded. He knows what he's doing. Good. Another moment. The creek in the distance was a silver line between the bare trees. A hawk was working the thermals somewhere above the rise, a patient dark shape against the pale sky. Garrick. Yeah. Thank you. She said it plainly, without the usual social wrapping that made gratitude easier to receive and harder to mean. You didn't have to do any of this. You'd already decided, before me, that Ashford was your business. But you still put yourself in front of those men in the canyon. You gave me information you'd been holding for months. You walked into that courthouse. She paused. Nobody asked you to. He was quiet for a moment. The gray horse shifted under him, and he settled it with a slight adjustment that was mostly habit. I've been asking myself that, he said. Why I stepped in. I don't have a clean answer. You don't need one. No, I know. But I've been thinking about it anyway. He looked at the horizon. I've spent a long time operating on the principle that other people's business was their own. Not out of indifference, I just told myself it was respect. Staying in my lane, not presuming to know better. He shook his head slightly. Somewhere it stopped being respect and started being convenience. Easier to not get involved. And then I watched those men in the canyon point a rifle at you, and I realized that the comfortable position I'd built for myself, the one where I stayed clear of things that weren't my problem, was only comfortable because other people were paying the cost of it. She listened. She didn't interrupt or offer reassurance. He was saying something real, and he needed to finish it. Ashford had been operating for 6 years, he said. I'd known about his methods for 4 months. I had the documents. I had the statements. I sat on all of it because I told myself I didn't have standing. He looked at her. I had standing the moment I understood what was happening and had the means to do something about it. I just didn't want to pay the price. You paid it eventually. Late, he said. Late is better than not at all. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, the Colworth woman, Edna. She lost her land 3 years ago. Whatever happens in the investigation, she doesn't get that specific thing back. No, Lena agreed. She doesn't. I think about that. So do I. She looked out at her land. But she got her statement into the court record. She got a sworn document that says what happened to her, that it was real, that it wasn't her failure. That's not the same as having the land back. But it's not nothing either. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who was accepting something they'd been working toward accepting. Iyasan. The final ruling came 11 days later, delivered by a rider from Caldwell Crossing to Doris's office in Ridgeback, and Doris sent word to Lena at her property where she had already been back for a week, working. She read the ruling at her kitchen table, standing up because she'd been outside and had just come in and hadn't sat down yet. The language was formal and somewhat dense, the way judicial language was, but the core of it was clear. The contract filed by D. Ashford was found to be fraudulent on grounds of forged signature and invalid witness testimony. The property known as the Mercer Homestead Northeast Parcel, 240 acres, was fully cleared of lien. All prior encumbrances arising from the fraudulent filing were null. The matter was referred to the territorial attorney for prosecution of document fraud charges. She set the paper down on the table. She looked out the kitchen window at the land. The sky was the white-gray of an overcast November afternoon, and the grass was brown, and the tree line along the creek was bare, and none of it was beautiful in any postcard sense of the word. It was just her land, looking like itself, in a season that had stripped away everything decorative and left only the essential. She did not feel what she expected to feel. She had thought, when she let herself imagine this moment, that there would be something large and definitive, some wave of emotion that matched the size of what she'd been through. What she actually felt was quieter than that. Not disappointment, more like recognition, the kind that came from understanding that the dramatic resolution existed in the moment of action, in the courthouse, and the canyon, and the line shack, and the cold alleys of Caldwell Crossing, and that what came after resolution was just life again, the ordinary, demanding, unremarkable business of going on. Which was, she thought, probably the right thing to feel. She put on her coat and went back outside. Calhoun's letter arrived 3 days after the ruling. In it, he described, in the careful language of a lawyer who had learned to manage expectations, the progress of the attorney's investigation. Ashford had been formally charged with document fraud and was awaiting trial. The investigation into the holding company was ongoing, with cooperation from the territorial courts expected but not guaranteed. Of the 7 prior successful acquisitions, 2 were being contested by the original owners with attorney's office support. The remaining 5 were complicated by subsequent property transfers and would likely require lengthy court processes to resolve, with uncertain outcomes. He had also found Edna Colworth. She was living on a rented property 40 miles east, running a small kitchen garden and taking in laundry work. The kind of reduced circumstances that came from losing a farm and having to start over in your 50s with whatever you had left. Calhoun wrote that she had been informed of the investigation and had expressed, in his words, careful gratitude, the kind of gratitude that was real but held back from full expression, because people who had been disappointed enough times learned to wait and see before they allowed themselves to fully feel something good. Lena read that line twice. She understood it completely. She wrote back to Calhoun that same day. She asked him to give Edna Colworth her address and her direct permission to write. She wasn't certain what would come of that, or whether Edna would take the offer, or what 2 women who'd been through similar versions of the same thing would actually say to each other if they did correspond. She didn't know if there was anything useful she could offer, or if offering was even the right instinct rather than something more like presumption. But she wrote the letter anyway, because doing nothing felt worse than the uncertainty of doing something imperfect. She sealed it and set it with the outgoing correspondence, and then she went out to work the fence line. Boyd Mercer came in December. She saw him from across the field, riding slowly, not with the energy of someone who had somewhere urgent to be, more with the pace of a person who needed time to finish thinking something through before they arrived. She watched him come and did not go to meet him. She waited by the east fence she'd been inspecting, and when he reached her, she looked at him with the expression she imagined was on her face, which was neither warm nor hostile, but simply present. He looked bad. Not physically. He was healthy enough. But in the way that people looked when they'd been carrying something heavy for a while, and it showed in the face, around the eyes. He'd lost weight, she'd noticed in Millhaven, and hadn't recovered it. "My father left," he said without preamble, "after the ruling. He said he was going south, somewhere the name Mercer didn't mean anything complicated. I heard. Dessa went with him. I didn't." He looked at the fence post she'd been examining. "I stayed." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I live here," he said, like it was simple. "I grew up here. This is where I know how to do things." He paused. "I know I signed that paper. I know what it means I did." "Yes." "I'm not asking you to forgive it." "Good," she said, "because I don't know if I can." He nodded. He'd expected that, or maybe he'd needed to hear it said plainly to know where he actually stood. "Is there work?" he said. She looked at him. He was 18 and had made a bad choice that he hadn't fully understood and was now standing in the consequences of it without his father to hide behind or blame. That was not an excuse, and she was not going to treat it as one. But she was also not going to pretend it was the same as what Harlan had done. Harlan, who had understood fully, who had weighed and calculated and decided. Boyd had been a tool, a willing one, but a tool. And he was here, in December, asking for work, which was more than most people managed. "There's always work," she said. "I can't pay much. I don't need much. I need to think about whether I can trust you on this property." He met her eyes. He didn't look away, which she respected, even grudgingly. "That's fair?" "Come back in 2 days," she said. "I'll have an answer by then." He nodded and rode back the way he'd come. She watched him go, this boy who'd signed his name on a line his father pointed to, who'd watched her at that breakfast table with the curious eyes of someone who didn't understand the full weight of what was happening. She thought about the 15-year-old who'd knocked over her fence post and come to her directly. She thought about the line between grace and stupidity, and about how rarely that line was as clear as people like to pretend. She went back to the fence post. When he came back 2 days later, she put him to work on the northeast fence line where the posts were worst. She paid him in meals and a small wage, which was all she had. He worked without complaint, which was all she'd asked for. The winter was hard but not devastating. the kind of winter the territory served up when it wanted to remind everyone that comfort was conditional. The creek froze in January and thawed mid-February. 3 of her cattle died in a cold snap in late January, which hurt, but it was 3 out of 41, and she'd expected to lose some and had planned accordingly. Garrick's fencing man arrived in late March, as promised, a quiet, competent man named Aldous, who looked at the east fence line with the specific appreciation of someone who actually enjoyed this kind of problem. He fixed the 3 posts she'd identified and found 2 more that were close enough to failure that he addressed those too, and left her a written assessment of the remaining line that she found genuinely useful in a way that documents about her property had never felt useful before. Garrick came with him. Not to supervise, Aldous didn't need supervision, but because he was heading into Ridgeback anyway, and the route went past her property line, and he had something to tell her. He told her over coffee at her kitchen table, which was the first time he'd been inside her house, a fact that carried some weight in a small community where who visited who was noted. The attorney's investigation found the principals behind the holding company, he said. 3 men, partners in a railroad speculation venture. They've been named as co-conspirators in the fraud charges. Will it stick? One of them has already negotiated cooperation in exchange for partial immunity, which means he's giving them the other 2. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. Calhoun says it's the best possible outcome of the investigation, given how these things normally go. She considered this. 3 men she'd never met, who'd never met her, who'd sat somewhere comfortable and Eastern and signed papers authorizing a mechanism that turned people's homes into line items in a ledger. They'd never seen the Mercer homestead. They'd never seen Edna Colworth's farm or any of the other 6 properties. They'd seen numbers in a projected rail corridor and decided the numbers were worth whatever it cost to clear the land. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more complicated, a tiredness that wasn't quite bitterness, the specific fatigue of understanding that some versions of harm were structural in ways that individual justice couldn't fully reach. 3 men being charged was right. It was necessary. It wasn't the same as the Colworth farm being restored, or the 5 unresolved properties finding their way back to the families that had built them. Justice, she was learning, was not a clean event. It was more like a direction, something you moved toward, sometimes gaining ground and sometimes losing it. And the best you could do was keep moving and be honest about the distance remaining. Calhoun also says, Garrick continued, that 2 of the unresolved 5 properties have been voluntarily returned by their current holders who don't want to be associated with the fraud case. The other 3 are still in court. Better than nothing. Considerably. He looked at her across the table. The kitchen was plain. She'd never had money or inclination for decorative things, but the morning light came through the east window at this hour in a way that made it feel warmer than its actual dimensions. She'd lived in this kitchen her whole life. She knew where the floor creaked and which drawer stuck in humid weather and the exact sound the wind made coming through the gap under the back door that she kept meaning to seal. "You look different than you did in October," he said. "It's been 5 months." "It's not time," he said. "It's something else." She looked at him. He wasn't the type to say things like that lightly, which meant he'd been thinking about it and decided to say it, which was its own form of honesty. "I feel like I'm here," she said after a moment. "On this land. Not just occupying it, actually here." She paused, looking for the right word and finding it was harder than she expected. "Before all of this, I think I'd been here out of habit, out of inertia. It was my father's land and then it was mine, and I stayed because staying was the default." She looked at the window, at the east fence line visible in the distance where Aldous was working. "When Harlan and Ashford tried to take it, I had to decide whether I actually wanted it, whether it was worth what it cost." She turned back to him. "It was. It is. But it took the fight to make me know that." He was quiet. He was listening with the full attention he gave to things, which was something she'd noticed early and continued to appreciate, that he didn't listen in the way some people did, waiting for their turn to speak. He listened like the information mattered. "I've been thinking about standing," he said. "What I said on your boundary line, about how I convinced myself I didn't have it when I did." He looked at the coffee cup. "I've been going through my records, the properties around me. There are 4 other homesteads in this territory that have received correspondence from Ashford or from business associates of his in the past year. The investigation will catch up with those eventually, but eventually is slow." "What are you thinking?" I'm thinking someone with standing in this community who knows what the correspondence looks like should be making contact with those families, explaining what the letters mean, telling them what happened here and what's possible. He looked at her. I can do some of that, but I'm one voice, and I've got a reputation that makes certain people cautious, somebody who has less history and more credibility with isolated homesteaders. Is that what you're calling this? It's what I'm thinking. She looked at him. It was not a romantic moment exactly. It was more practical than that. Two people at a kitchen table discussing a problem they'd both been thinking about separately and had just discovered they'd been thinking toward the same place. The romance of frontier stories was mostly invented by people who'd never actually tried to work one. The real version was more like this. Functional, unglamorous, built on the specific trust that came from having gone through something hard together and finding that the other person had held up. She didn't know what she and Garrett Crow were to each other. She suspected that question was going to take longer to answer than she currently had patience for, and that the answer, when it came, was going to be more complicated and more durable than anything she could name right now. What she knew was that he was a man who had eventually chosen right, at real cost, and who was now sitting in her kitchen asking how to choose right again. That was enough for today. I'll ride with you, she said. When you go to the first family, I'll ride with you and we'll explain it together. He nodded. Good. When? When Aldous finishes the fence line. She almost smiled. Right. Edna Colworth wrote back in April. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in the same careful script Lena had recognized in the sworn statement. The script of someone who took their time over words because they understood that words, once committed to paper, lasted. She described her current life without self-pity, but without false brightness either. She said she was managing. She said managing was not the same as living fully, but that it was something to work from. She said she'd been afraid, when she first received Lena's address from Calhoun, that it was the kind of offer people made when they meant well but didn't think through. The kind that generated one exchange and then became an obligation neither person knew how to end gracefully. She said she'd decided to write anyway because she was too old to refuse connection out of fear of disappointment. She said, I read about what you did in that courthouse. I don't know you, but I've been thinking about you since Calhoun told me, and what I think is this. The hardest part of what happened to me was not the loss of the land. It was the loss of being believed. The feeling that what had been done to me was invisible, that no one with authority had seen it and called it what it was. What you did in that courthouse made it visible. Not just yours, mine too. That matters to me more than I can make plain in a letter. Lena read the letter twice and then set it on the table beside the window where the morning light came through. She sat there for a while. The land outside was doing what spring did, coming back, slow and unremarkable, the grass beginning to show green at the roots under the brown surface, the creek running higher with snowmelt from the elevations. She'd seen this transition every year of her life, and it still did something to her that she couldn't properly explain, this annual argument that the ground made for itself. She thought about what Edna had written, about being believed, about visibility. She'd been so focused on the practical stakes, the land, the lien, the contract, the court record, that she hadn't thought as clearly about that part of it. The way that fraud worked partly through erasure, through making the victim invisible and the action acceptable. The way that having it named publicly, by a judge with a record to maintain, did something that private knowledge never could. Her father had told her once, when she was young and had been badly treated by a classmate and hadn't known how to talk about it, that the worst thing about cruelty was that it tried to make you doubt your own account of events. That the cruelty itself hurt, but the secondary damage was the way it worked to convince you that what happened hadn't happened, or hadn't been as bad as you thought, or had somehow been your fault. He'd said, the most important thing is to know what's true, not what's comfortable. What's true. And then say it out loud to someone who can hear it. She'd been 20 years carrying that and hadn't thought about it in probably 10. Now it surfaced whole and clear, the way things did when you'd finally lived something that the advice had always been pointing toward. She was going to write back to Edna. She was going to write back and she was going to say, plainly, without the social wrapping that made things easier to give and harder to receive, that what Edna had done, by committing her experience to a sworn statement and allowing it to be part of the case, was not a small thing, that it had mattered, that the record existed in part because Edna Colworth had taken her time over every word, and she was going to ask Edna if she would be willing to speak to the 4 homesteading families in the territory who'd received letters from Ashford's associates. Not because Edna's land could be given back to her, but because Edna knew something those families needed to know. What this looked like before it was too late, what it felt like, and what was possible. It was imperfect. Everything about this situation was imperfect. The justice partial, the timeline long, the losses real and not fully recoverable. But imperfect was the material you had to work with when the world was what it was. And the question was not whether the material was sufficient, but whether you were willing to work it. She was willing. She pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and uncapped her pen and started writing. The fence line was finished in late April. All the posts Aldous had identified, and the original 3 and the 2 additional ones, were reset and solid, and he'd left her a clear assessment of the rest of the line that told her what to watch and when. Boyd had helped with the deeper post holes in the northeast corner, working with the specific care of someone trying to be useful in a way that was visible without being performed. She hadn't forgiven him completely. She wasn't certain that complete forgiveness was something she was built for, and she'd stopped pressuring herself about it. What she'd done was something smaller and more practical. She'd decided that what Boyd did going forward was its own thing, separate from what he'd done before, and that she was going to judge him on the forward evidence while never pretending the prior evidence didn't exist. That wasn't magnanimity, it was just a workable arrangement. The morning Aldous left, she stood at the east fence line where she'd met Garrick the month before, at the corner post that she'd reset herself the previous April. It was a solid post now. It would need checking in a few years, but it would hold. She put her hand on it and felt the solidity of it, and thought about her father, who had built most of this fence line and had been proud of it in the specific way of a man who valued things that were built to last. He'd been dead 11 years, and she still talked to him sometimes, in the way of people who had been shaped by someone and couldn't quite stop the conversation even after it was technically over. She thought, I kept it, Pa. It took a fight, but I kept it. And then she thought, the fight wasn't just for me. That's the part I didn't understand until the middle of it. She'd ridden out of her uncle's house believing this was about her land, her future, her betrayal. And all of that was true. But somewhere in the canyon with men blocking the trail, somewhere in Calhoun's office reading Edna Colworth's careful words, somewhere in the Caldwell Crossing courtroom watching her uncle tell a truth he hadn't planned to tell. It had become something else as well. Something that included other people's land, other people's betrayals, other people's careful words committed to paper in the hope that someone would eventually read them seriously. Loyalty was earned, not given. She'd known that before, but she hadn't fully understood the corollary. That belonging wasn't just about the place, it was about what you did for the people in it. That a community was not a fact but a daily decision, remade by every choice about whether to show up or stay clear, whether to spend the price or find a comfortable reason not to. Garrick Crow had spent the price. Late, by his own admission, and at a cost to himself he hadn't fully calculated going in. Boyd Mercer was spending a different kind of price. Slower, more uncertain, no guarantee of where it landed. Edna Colworth had spent it years ago, alone, and had kept paying it in the quiet, reduced circumstances of a life interrupted. Calhoun had spent it across 30 years of practicing law in places where law was constantly being tested against power and didn't always win. None of them were heroes. She wasn't one either. They were just people who had done, eventually, the thing that needed doing, with varying degrees of timing and grace and personal cost. That was all heroism ever actually was. Not the absence of fear or self-interest, but the decision to act anyway, when the moment asked for it and you had what the moment needed. She let go of the fence post and looked out across the 240 acres that were hers, that would still be hers in the spring when the grass came back fully, that she would work and tend and argue with and love, in the particular complicated way she loved things that had cost her something real. The sky was wide and the country was large, and the frontier, the actual frontier, the one that existed not in the romantic stories but in the daily, ordinary, difficult lives of the people on it, went on in every direction, full of people trying to hold on to what they'd built, and people trying to take it, and people trying to figure out which side of that line they were on. She knew which side she was on. She turned back toward the house and went to write her letter.